not gonna lie. It's real ugly out there.
Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. This is Omaha here. Gears 5 has officially launched worldwide, the 6th installment in the mainline Gears of War gaming franchise, and the second entry in the new Gears of War trilogy produced by the developers The Coalition. I bought the Ultimate Edition of Gears 5, which granted owners 5-day early access to play the game early, and over that time played through Gears 5's entire campaign story mode. I finished the entire campaign on a solo insane difficulty playthrough, and after finishing it, I felt kind of bored. To elaborate, playing the campaign was really fun gameplay-wise, but in regards to the narrative aspects and the story, not so much. Yeah, I gotta be honest, Gears 5's story didn't impress me very much. First off, let's talk about the qualities of Gears 5's story campaign that worked. The color, textures, and environments in Gears 5 is nothing short of gorgeous. Unlike in the previous entry, Gears of War 4, where the colors and environments were hidden most of the time and not as eye-popping with very generic color patterns that one would see most of the time in plenty of other games in general, Gears 5's really stands out. The attention to detail is fantastic to when you move around in the world, interacting with it, and therefore much more interesting to look at for the most part. The voice acting remains very good from start to finish from all the classics, returning characters, as well as new ones, even if the material and the writing the actors have to work with isn't really the most interesting stuff. The role-playing additional secondary story missions in the campaign were by far the most interesting, as they all revolved around deep within the Gears of War lore. The fan service to the Gears of War lore was very rich in this campaign, as no matter where you explored or adventured to, the campaign was filled with it for any Gears of War universe fan to discover and enjoy. In addition, unlike Gears of War 4's story, Gears 5's had clear direction this time. It attempted to bring the story in a new direction and thus slightly had a clear plot than the previous game, which just attempted to be about everything. And if you've seen my video talking about Gears of War 4's story, you know already that was a big no. Because in essence, in order to achieve great viewer investment and to avoid lackluster emotions, all stories should feature just two primary sides of characters, a side to root for and a side to root against. Now of course there can be exceptions to this, but even in those rare cases, you might still find that they aren't really exceptions at all. And that is the mindset that Gears 5's story follows for the most part. Gears 5's story also had nice balance between its characters and manages to divide all of its different characters into comprehensible sides of good and evil. In addition, the Hammer of Dawn makes a return in Gears 5 as a very strong plot device this time. The story in almost its entirety revolves around the Hammer of Dawn weapon, as the heroes plan to use it to hopefully put the Swarm down once and for all. Despite some objections, both of which that are explained and developed pretty well. And lastly, well, the classic characters once again prove why they are the greatest and still are at the end, which was kind of expected. But beyond that, there isn't really a lot to justify this story's existence. So let's take a closer look why Gears 5's story campaign doesn't work. First off, if you recall how Gears of War 4's story began, it started off with the tension and battling between the Outsiders and the new coalition of ordered governments. Outsiders of Sera did not support the COG and therefore were completely against everyone and everything related to it, given the history the COG has done in the past, as well as express their personal views to be free and independent. That supposedly main plotline comes up again in Gears 5, but this time around with answers instead of questions. Remember that whole Settlement 2 debacle that was brought up multiple times from the characters in Gears of War 4, and we had no idea what this thing was, other than the fact it was some sort of violent confrontation of some kind? Well, in Gears 5, we finally get an answer to that. It turns out that the Settlement 2 event was a protest conducted by the Outsiders for their opposition against the COG. James Phoenix, along with the company of Dale Walker and brand new character Faz Chutani, led COG military forces and DB robots to oversee the protest and provide security. The protest escalated to violent clashes where Outsiders began assaulting and attacking COG soldiers, as well as throwing fire and incendiary-related objects against them. With soldiers' lives at stake, as well as COG citizens in the surrounding area in harm's way and out of options, James ordered to open fire on the violent rioting protesters, along with his comrade Foz, who did the same. Multiple people were killed in the process. Dell, on the other hand, did not participate in the shooting and thought the call to shoot the protesters was wrong, while James and Foz felt the use of lethal force had been justified due to the great danger posed by the rioting protesters. And if you thought this subplot could get any worse, well, it does, as the narrative illustrates James Phoenix as a horrible person. Literally, folks, I am not making this up. The narrative describes James did a really awful thing, and therefore we should detest and discard him. All simply because he was doing his job and was forced to make a tough decision. A decision he did not want to make, but had no choice but to do so. Now, I understand the morale behind this moment from this event in the story, but given the facts that James was an officer of the law, protection, assistance of the general public, and the maintenance of public order for the COG, he did nothing wrong performing his duty.
You did what you had to do.
But for inexplicable reasons the narrative presents, he is a horrible person, so we should reject him. Which resulted into the least important factor throughout the entire story campaign. This is also the plausible reason why the story completely changes its main protagonist to character Kate Diaz. As a matter of fact, the story doesn't make it clear at all why Kate is now the main protagonist going forward, as well as explain why she is all of a sudden now completely in charge of everything, even freely without any consequences, completely disobeying direct orders and going against the chain of command in the COG military. Remember when Gears of War characters in the military from the lore defied orders? I rest my case.
I told you to stay on that island, Lieutenant.
Well, Captain, screw your order. This isn't about you, it's about me.
And boy, was this story all front and center about her. For a character that started out as a supporting companion character in the last game to suddenly claim the main role of the story was unjustified. Not saying Kate Diaz was a terrible protagonist, I personally thought she was okay, but in regard to the character's arc and persona from the last game, she doesn't have the correct justifications to be the main protagonist. Now, the Coalition has stated that this new trilogy of Gears of War games is about Kate's story. But here's a question. If these Gears of War games are about Kate Diaz and her adventures, why did we get an entire story about JD in Gears of War 4? Not to mention, the entire first act of Gears 5 story campaign is about JD. Now, all of a sudden, he is removed down to playing second fiddle. So how can you say a story is about someone, and yet you focus the narrative entirely about somebody else? It just doesn't add up. Furthermore, Kate Diaz's character in Gears 5 continues to be semi-static. She's starting to show some level of uncertainty that's pulling her away from the single-minded, everything is about me and everything about me has to be about me kind of character from the last game, but it doesn't feel enough for me to really get behind her. Plus, based off of everything this character has done to this point, she still has yet to really prove herself to be taken seriously, since her character is just too perfect and bland for lack of flaws. As for Del Walker, who accompanies Kate throughout most of the story in Gears 5, his character does improve a lot from Gears of War 4. He moves away from his one-dimensional everything is a joke personality, but after the Settlement 2 part in the story, he becomes a complete douchebag, as well as a straight-up servant to Kate and Kate alone. In quick summary, Del volunteers to openly accompany Kate on her quest to find answers. He has no idea what he is getting himself into. Whenever he tries to get answers from Kate, she repeatedly says throughout she has no idea what she's doing, but she's not going to stop what she's doing until she finds answers. Whenever JD shows up to talk to him or help, he treats JD like a leper because JD kept a secret from him. He can't let it go, and therefore holds a strong grudge against him, his best friend, which as a result just makes this whole team up a lackluster to really follow. Why do you think Marcus Phoenix and Dominic Santiago's relationship from the original trilogy was so strong and impactful? Because despite all the good and bad that came between them throughout their adventures together, they always put aside their differences, supported each other, and never even for a thought wanted to push one or the other away through thick and thin. Brothers in arms at its finest. But Gears 5 story's biggest problem is not only its main protagonist and character issues, but the overarching fact that the entire story was just kind of dull. It's not because the story was slow-paced or not interesting. In fact, Gears 5's story wasn't very slow-paced. The dullness comes from the fact, as stated, it's a story that's just spinning its wheels. And since the story is completely passive and knows it's passive because it's quite obviously saving almost everything for the final installment, Gears of War 6, that results in me just not getting attached. Players had to choose if JD or Del dies in this story. I chose to let Del die, and I didn't care. No matter how much the entire story wanted me to care getting to this out of left field moment, I did not. Plus, after playing through this moment towards the final act of the campaign, it doesn't make sense. First of all, why wasn't there an option to not save Kate, given the fact that she was in the same exact life-threatening situation as JD and Del were? Why were we only given the choice just to save only 2 of these characters? After all, this was a player-controlled choice, right? So why weren't all outcomes available, especially considering the way this whole moment presented itself? Now, you're all probably going to say, well, the reason why Kate's fate was not an option here because she is the main character. That's actually not true, and here's why. Kate is not the main protagonist. She is a false protagonist. A false protagonist in a story is a character that is made or disguised to look like the main character of a story. These characters get exposed as not being the protagonists in narratives due to such as a plot twist or shock values. The plot twist in Gears 5 is that Kate is the next queen of the Locust Swarm, so therefore that makes her evil. She is not a logical hero for audiences to get behind. She technically says she does not want that destiny, but all of her actions and events that she has done keeps pushing her in that direction, which results with her to not be entirely good. Hence why gamers should have had the freedom of choice to save her or not. And secondly, where was Jackbot during this moment? Jack could have stopped Queen Reyna and saved these characters. Not to mention, he literally saves everyone minutes later in the final act of the campaign. So according to this story, you're telling me that Jack was nowhere to be found in this moment, yet he was always around helping and supporting the heroes throughout the entire story, but miraculously takes action shortly later to save the day for the heroes right after? I'm sorry, I find that very hard to believe. Since these events are so close from each other, there is no possible way you could draw any sort of causality from one to the other. Now, just because I really enjoyed a game's campaign and the freedom of choices the game presented, doesn't mean I can't get invested in it. But this story just didn't pull it off. So part 1 was a misstep of nothing, and part 2 was disjointed. It's not a bad story necessarily, but it's definitely not a good one. Gears of War 6 will have to pull out all the stops and be the greatest thing ever. Otherwise, the new Gears of War trilogy is not going to be remembered fondly in the future, from a story campaign standpoint. But if Gears of War 6 does in fact pull out all the stops, does that justify a semi-lackluster Part 1 and Part 2? As the old saying goes, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And so far, the journey isn't exactly memorable. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Omaha, signing off.